Hey YouTube, Mikamu here with another Let's Talk segment. This is a segment on my channel where I talk to you about things that are of interest to me. This time I'm going to do something a little bit different by talking to you about game design. It's not normally something I talk about. I know that there are Mario Maker segments on my channel, but I don't really do contemporary game analysis, so it's something that's a bit of new territory for me. But I want to say I really like analyzing the hell out of things, especially video games, and I do want to one day make my own platformer. So there's that. So I've always been kind of thinking about games from a bit of a design perspective, at least as an amateur. Anyway, as you can tell from the footage, I want to talk about the game that everybody else is talking about, so I can join in on the conversation. And unless you've been living on the rock, you know what I'm talking about. This is Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild, and honestly, at least on the surface, there's not much I could say to introduce this game. It's a phenomenal game. A lot of people have talked about it from both a game design perspective and simply from an aesthetic perspective, and a lot of ground has been covered by other YouTubers who I'm gonna link their stuff in this video, in annotations and in the description, so you can kind of get a fuller picture of what people are saying, at least game design wise. However, one big question I had that I saw no one else asking was, and before we go forward, I want to say there are going to be some spoilers. Mind the spoilers. No direct, story spoilers, but the footage will be giving away little secrets of the game, and I'm going to be talking about, game design facets and features of the game. So obvious statement is obvious, but I just want to cover my bases here. Um, anyway, as you can tell from my question, in the title, that's my question: is the game elegant? But that's not where I started. My first question was, is Breath of the Wild minimalist? And what do I mean by that? Well, the game, at least at first glance, has this really simplistic aesthetic. Even though, the game is filled with content, it's done so in a way that seems somewhat empty. You've got the simplistic menu screen when the game first starts, to the simplistic title card in the beginning of the first scene of the game. It's just white text on a black screen. Then you've got the lack of a traditional Zelda soundtrack, which a lot of people are angry about. And then you've got these wide open, empty spaces that seem to be taking up a lot of your experience in the game. It seems that in today's hipster world, more is less, and so minimalism is part of the design gospel. It felt like initially, at least, that Nintendo was kind of cashing in on this by doing something that was sort of hipster and avant-garde and chic. And I just didn't make a pun, yeah. But they did something that was hip and cool by trying to fit in this sort of minimalistic aesthetic into the game, like having a deconstructed soundtrack, for example. But what I realized eventually was that this minimalism is kind of not the focus of the game, because the game is filled with content. It's just very precise and withholding about how it presents that content. And so I came to the conclusion that asking if the Breath of the Wild was minimalist is a bad question, or at the very least, it's a question that fails to grasp the bigger picture of this game. What makes it a bad question is the fact that as I continue playing the game, Breath of the Wild's minimalism began to display features of unifying patterns that brought together the different aspects of the game really well. It was important to how I played the game. These wide open spaces, the minimalistic music, they weren't simply for aesthetics' sake, they weren't simply for appearance's sake. They played a very important and central role in my experiencing of the game. So after going back to the drawing board, for me, the correct question was the one in the title. Is Breath of the Wild an elegant game? Now, by elegant, I don't mean necessarily fancy or beautiful. I'm using elegant in the same sense that mathematicians and scientists use elegant. And for these really smart people, elegant basically means that an idea is amazingly simple and it holds a high degree of explanatory power. Usually this means that the idea either builds off of existing ideas well, or it connects a lot of different concepts together that may have not been connected before. So, without going too deep into the forest, think of something like E equals MC squared. It's literally 5 characters connecting 3 different concepts together. So, you've got light, matter, and energy. Before, these things were separate. When Einstein came along, he connected them in a way that was novel, it was new, it was also more holistic, it was like a more complete understanding of the universe. So, I know it's not a game design term, but what does that mean in terms of game design? Well, thinking about it, I think an elegant feature of a game would be a feature that either connects a lot of other features together, so it serves multiple purposes, or it's a feature that is very simplistic itself, but is very integral to the experiencing of the game. I want to point out here again that I don't mean that this game is perfect or that it's beautiful, but I simply mean that the game is efficient, if that makes more sense. It's using these features that seem very simple in the face, but they are really complicated in how they define the character of the game. And so that's basically what I mean by elegant. And for me, there are roughly about 4 features in the game that I can point to that are, I think, good examples of what kind of describe if Zelda is an elegant game. I've got the music, you've got the wide open spaces in the HUD, and you've got the physics engine, which I know is pretty complicated in itself, but the physics engine is just one thing that you experience in a certain way. And then finally, you've got the main content of the game. You've got the seeds and the dungeons, or not the dungeons, but the shrines. So these are the 4 areas I'm thinking about talking about. So let's talk about the music first. So I want to start out by saying I really love the Legend of Zelda soundtrack. It's one of my biggest inspirations. I actually write video game music, and hashtag shameless plug, I have a SoundCloud. You can Google Mikamu. Uh, anyway, imagine my surprise when I heard this lack of a soundtrack. I wasn't very happy, and I understood where a lot of people were coming from, but obviously I've had a change of heart if I'm talking about it in the video now. So what I realized is that Breath of the Wild has a dynamic system of cues, ambience, and stems that combine with the environmental noises or sometimes the absence of music for the sake of immersion. And I've really come to love this system because I think it's ingenious from a design standpoint. It serves multiple purposes, especially the story and the gameplay. I think the only reason why we see it negatively is because we're kind of spoiled with the epic orchestra that the franchise normally provides us with. But the role of music in a game isn't to make the player feel good, it's to serve the world and the nature of the story. And this world, frankly, has a unique and specific history, and a depressing history at that. And that's reflected by the musical tone of the game, and sometimes even the absence of music within the game. Furthermore, there are fluid cues throughout the game that kind of alert you to changes in your environment. Like, this game also has demands of the player's attention, and I think that that is really reflected by the choice to have a sort of dynamic, minimalist kind of soundtrack. For example, you can hear the Guardian, if there's a Guardian behind you with a certain unique kind of cue. Regardless of where it is on the screen, you feel that. And I remember my first encounter of the Guardian was behind me, and I felt like Link did. I felt this sort of dread that was suddenly behind me. Or when you go to an enemy encampment and you kind of begin messing with them, you can kind of hear the music change depending on how aggressive you come in to attack them. Or as you approach a town, you can hear the the lull of civilization as you're coming from a long and weary journey. And that works in reverse too. As you're leaving, you can hear the fading music calling you to linger a bit more as you enter the lonely world again. And that's only made more powerful by the fact that only when people are around you do you hear a world with bright and full music. I talked about this on Reddit, and to paraphrase myself, I said something like, the lack of a full-on soundtrack in favor of cues and stems is a storytelling choice that drives home how depressing and frankly empty this iteration of Hyrule is. You're not supposed to feel really like any previous version of Link, but rather like a lonely traveler traversing a vast land ruined on its verge of its ultimate apocalypse, moving forward solely out of obligation. And I think the lack of music at times, and sometimes the minimalistic music, kind of reflect that. And at the risk of oversimplification and beating a dead horse dead, I don't think we get the same sense of immersion in storytelling if we had a triumphant Hyrule theme that was blaring on repeat every 1 minute to 30 seconds. And I know you can kind of add musical cues and stems to, a full-on soundtrack, but I feel that what we have now works better because of the kind of attention that the game demands of the player. Mark Brown of Game Maker's Toolkit actually has an amazing video going into detail on the topic. So the second point I want to talk about is the game's HUD in conjunction with its wide open spaces. By the way, YouTubers with design chops far more formidable than my own have talked about this point at length, so if you want a more official take on the subject, I'll link to a Breath of the Wild playlist in the description, and also there'll be annotations throughout the videos, as I said before. So my take is pretty much a synthesis of what a lot of other people are saying. Snowman Gaming, Writing on Games, and Rasputin have talked about the importance that space plays in Breath of the Wild. Basically, space helps give you breathing room and time to reflect on your experiences, and space makes the world more organic through its pacing. So not only are you forced to explore more when everything is spaced out, but the instances in which you actually encounter things are made more novel. You get to actually interact with your environment because of the uniqueness of each encounter. And also, because of your particular time reflecting, it kind of makes your experiences of the world unique and different. It's your own story, as Kotaku said in their Breath of the Wild video. Anyway, combining this with the minimalistic HUD actually really creates the optimal environment for discovery, novelty, and exploration. Even on subsequent playthroughs, your experiences will most likely not be the same. So many open world games are filled with tons and tons of content, but that's not what makes Zelda novel. It's that, as many have said, Zelda isn't filled with these markers telling you where to go or how to do things or what to get, even. Basically, by providing less, the game gives you more. It gives you your own experience, literally, every time you play the game. So that's really what defines the HUD and the spacing, basically. And the most interesting thing, really, is the fact that the game kind of encourages you to play with Pro Mode. I'm serious about this. If you remember, or if you've gotten past the tutorial, you'll remember that at the very end, you were given directions to Kakariko Village. And you're given directions not necessarily by map, but you're actually told to follow a landmark, the Twin Peaks, basically. You're actually facing the road that you have to take to get there. And that's what really makes the game interesting, because a lot of players in future side quests give you directions via landmarks, not by putting a waypoint in your map, not by necessarily telling you the names of places. Although in a lot of cases they may do so. They may say you can consult your map, but when they do so, it kind of feels like they're cheating you. And there was one NPC I remember, and they told me, if it comes to that, you can look at your map. So the game really wants players to experience the full kind of realness of playing the game without the mini map. They want you kind of to just enjoy the journey and the experience that comes from moving throughout this vast world. So moving on, the third thing I want to talk about is the game's physics engine. You're probably thinking like, hey, isn't that like the most complex thing of Breath of the Wild, if not in recent gaming history? Well, you'd be right, probably. This is the reason why the game got delayed after all. But on the other hand, the interesting thing is that the physics engine is the main way we as players interact with the world of Breath of the Wild to solve environmental puzzles or defeat enemies or simply maneuvering around. What makes it really elegant is that in a lot of aspects, there's a high degree of intuition involved when you're trying to take advantage of the game's physics. For example, food provides different levels of nutrition depending on whether it's simply thrown on an open flame or cooked. Or consider that at any time you can start a fire and create an updraft for you to either approach enemies with or do whatever. Or you can consume cooked peppers to deal with extreme cold, or you can freeze water to make a unique approach option. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, no pun intended. The game also sets its expectations for you with its engine. Knowing how well you can scale a cliff, especially in rain, is very important for maneuvering throughout Breath of the Wild. Or consider that when you tumble, you'll take extra damage. There are so many environmental hazards that I won't spoil too. And all of this just adds character and challenge to the experience that you have as a player. But ultimately, the great thing about the engine is that it creates all of these things simply through intuition. These facts about Breath of the Wild are things that are partially true about our own world. I mean, they don't import perfectly from our real world physics, but they're close enough that it makes it insanely easy to remember these things. You don't need to memorize complex button inputs or, you don't need to memorize obscure facts about Breath of the Wild. These are intuitive aspects of Breath of the Wild that are based on things, at least partially, in our own world. So my last point, my fourth and final point, is about the main content of this game, the Korok Seeds and the Shrines. Sure, Breath of the Wild has tons of side quests and tons of things you could do, but by sheer number, there are more Korok Seeds and Shrines in the world, and that's for a good reason. So what if I told you that there's a way you could remove the worst parts of an RPG? Well, Breath of the Wild accomplishes this by removing grinding. I don't want to call Breath of the Wild an action RPG or an RPG, but at its heart, it has some aspects of those genres. Notice I'm not calling it an RPG or an action RPG, I'm just saying it has elements from the genres. So that means that enemies, for example, get progressively stronger throughout the game. So for example, if you go to Hyrule Castle, you're going to fight the strongest enemies in the game. I don't recommend going there at the beginning of the game, and because I'm pretty neurotic, I didn't record any footage from there. But the point is, at a certain point in the game, you're going to start encountering stronger enemies, and the game doesn't necessarily force you to do things like, level up. The game doesn't force you to necessarily get good at the fighting system, although you can. Instead, the game motivates you to gain experience through one thing, and that's exploring. You could do what you've been doing throughout the game. Just let your curiosity lead you to new places, and if you happen to notice shrines or Korok seeds, you can take advantage of these things because these things are guaranteed to level your character up and get you more hearts, more stamina, more inventory. And that's what's going to make it the game easier for somebody who necessarily may not have the get good strategy of mastering the fighting system, or even like you would in a regular RPG, level up. So that's what makes these two elements, the Korok seeds and shrines, really unique. They really let you level up without having to do anything other than explore. The promise of this game simply is if you explore, you will necessarily get better at the game. And that's what makes Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild so amazing. Now, I'm not saying the shrines are the greatest thing ever or the Korok seeds are the best, but they're pretty good at what they do. Super Bunny Hop, though, has a really good video commenting on the shortcomings of the system, and I'll link to that, of course. To paraphrase his argument, he says that Breath of the Wild kind of relies on mostly the same kinds of gimmicks and mechanics, which makes the game more stale than it should be. And that's a very valid point. I mostly agree with him, because these are genuine, especially design limitations that make the game less fun. But I like to caveat that if you play the game a certain way, then these flaws become far more apparent. It's an argument that a lot of people have made, including Mother's Basement, which I will link to that video. I'll stop saying that, but I will link to his video too. And while it seems like a cop-out, I think it's partially true that if you play the game a certain way, then the game's less fun. Going back to RPGs, you can kind of sit by the first town, for example, and raise your party to level 99, but the game doesn't guarantee that that'll be a fun thing to do. You're free to do that, but it's not going to be fun. Similarly, in Zelda can't promise you that, say, collecting all those Korok seeds will make the game better. And in fact, spoilers, if you don't want to hear anything, the game doesn't promise that every Korok seed will enhance your inventory. End of spoilers. Now, I know this comparison to regular RPGs, and hell, even to action RPGs, is not a one-to-one comparison. RPGs, for example, are designed in a way that encourage leveling up while exploring the world. And contrast that to Breath of the Wild, where it seems the game is designed in a way where completionists, at least, are invited to try and find every Korok seed or complete every shrine. But I think the analogy still holds, because finding enough of these things or solely setting out to look for these things is this game's version of grinding. There is a natural flow of the game that encourages you to explore and not go out of your way simply to look for shrines or Korok seeds. In that regard, as Mother's Basement pointed out, these seeds, or hell, even the shrines, are more akin to coins than they are to anything else. And while there's a benefit, for example, to collecting coins in Mario, that's not the point of the game. In Mario, you're not going to go back to World 1-1 to make sure every coin's accounted for, at least not in your first playthrough. But in Breath of the Wild, there's enough variety in the manner in which you encounter the seeds or the shrines that I feel that the world provides a pool that makes these things more of a brief distraction than anything else. The most fun in this game I think you'll have is when you don't plan on doing anything. The game will pull to you into your media environment with what Rasputin calls questions in one of his videos. So this isn't meant to excuse the lack of fun that a determined completionist might have with this game, or to say that improvements can't be made to future Zelda games down the line. But again, as Rasputin points out at the end of his video on questions, what this boils down to is that we want a game that offers 50 hours of gameplay to have even more playtime. What I personally hope, though, is that maybe with this so-called open air system, we can see more traditional Zelda dungeons and perhaps even environmental puzzles presented within the biomes of each part of the game in a future Zelda installment. Something like this might bypass the content diversity issues that this game seems to have. So those are roughly the 4 areas I think where Breath of the Wild kind of demonstrates elegance. My hope is with this video, and in general, that no one simply takes away that this game is doing less is more. While the game is seemingly simplistic, at least from an aesthetic standpoint, every element of the game is deeply layered into what defines Breath of the Wild, either by serving both the story and the gameplay, and one of the, I think, the rare instances of good gameplay and story integration I've seen in a long time, or by using its simplicity to allow the player to access the systems that truly define Breath of the Wild. Going forward, I'm hoping we can see more elegant game design, not just in games like Zelda, but in other types of games. This game is definitely giving me a lot to think about as an amateur designer, and I'm not even at the 50-hour mark. Anyway, everyone, I hope you enjoyed this discussion on Breath of the Wild, and thanks for watching.